Buenas tardes, siendo exactamente las 18:30 horas, les saluda el profesor Cristian Cristóful, coordinador del Departamento de Inglés del Instituto Superior de Lenguas en calidad de moderador. Se da inicio a la defensa virtual de Tesina acorde a la resolución número 1842/2022 que fija fecha y hora de la tesina con el título The Evolution of Practices and Resources from a Face-to-Face to an Online Class Setting in a Private School in Asunción, Teaching EFL During the COVID-19 Pandemic, a cargo de las autoras Verónica Anaí Aranda Barrios y Natalia Belén Martínez Galeano, de la carrera de Lengua Inglesa del Instituto Superior de Lenguas el día de hoy, jueves 22 de diciembre del 2022. Casi Navidad. En calidad de presidente del Tribunal Examinador nos acompaña la profesora Melissa Ramos. Muy buenas tardes, profesora.
Buenas tardes, profesor Cristóful. Buenas tardes a todos. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this wonderful oral defense. I'm happy to see everybody here. Just to let you know, the students will have 30 minutes to present, and then the committee will have a few minutes to ask questions to both students. Just also, we are inviting anybody who wants to hear the presentation. The family members and friends are also very welcome. And welcome to Professora Romina Bento and to Professor Sharon Weaver. Thank you so much for your time. So I give the floor to the students, and feel free to start your presentation when you feel like it's the time.
Good evening, professors, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Today is our defense, of course. We are Veronica, Aranda, and Natalia Martinez, and our topic is the evolution of practices and resources from a face-to-face to an online class setting in a private school in Asunción, teaching EFL during the COVID-19 pandemic.
So let's start with the whole thing. The main purpose of this research was to analyze and describe the processes by which the traditional classes shifted to a completely online setting, focusing on the transition of the practices and resources observed in selected class recordings at the elementary level. In addition, we would also like to describe the challenges that teachers encountered when attempting to implement these traditional practices and resources in a completely online setting. So basically, what we observed and want to describe in depth is that if these traditional practices, the ones that we're familiar with in an F2F setting, were able to adapt and be carried on to a completely online format.
We have three research questions. We have the main question, that is, how did traditional EFL practices and resources evolve in a virtual classroom at the elementary level during the COVID-19 pandemic? Then two secondary questions, the first one being, what challenges did teachers encounter when transferring traditional practices and resources to the virtual classroom? And what online teaching practices and resources were the most successful in a virtual classroom?
Now, in order to answer these questions, the method used was a case study, because this method would allow us to generate and construct knowledge, hypotheses, and theory from the data that has been collected, and to explain the boundaries between a phenomenon and context that are not clearly evident. The phenomenon being transitioning from a traditional F2F classroom to a completely online one, and the context being the worldwide pandemic that had us all in lockdown for months. By using this method, the aim is to see the evolution that online practices had in different stages of the school period during the first year of the pandemic and the period of adaptation to a new modality, along with how they were implemented in the classroom as alternative to traditional practices commonly seen in a regular setting.
For settings and participants, we have the classes to be observed that were in the first cycle. So we have first, second, and third grade, along with their assigned teachers. In total, we have 5 teachers, teacher A, B, C, D, and E, but teachers D and E were replaced after the first observation due to school changes. So at the end, we have teachers A, B, and C throughout the entire process. And to give context, we have 18 to 20 students per class with their corresponding teacher throughout the different observations made.
Now, for the statement of the problem, due to the pandemic and as a response to it, in an attempt to manage the spread of COVID-19, countries implemented several protocols and regulations that we're all familiar with by now that affected the traditional classroom setting and teaching elementary level as we knew it. So there was this sudden transition from traditional classroom, the physical shared space, which entails that the standard curriculum, which is usually taught in person by a teacher, needed to be switched to a completely online modality. So there was this necessity to adapt the different classroom elements to fit the new guidelines. Now, the focus of these will be in two main aspects of the transition: teaching practices and the online resources used.
As mentioned before, the data is composed of class recordings from the first cycle from a private school in Asunción teaching EFL, and 3 separate recorded interviews to the teachers observed. Those were teachers A, teacher B, and teacher C. Before the recordings, we made some criteria to observe properly. The first one being which teaching practices were the most successful at this level of instruction, and which resources emerged in virtual classes. What was their role in class and how they evolved throughout the year, looking at the different observations that we made.
Now, these class recordings that compose our data, we observe a total of 27 hours approximately, since the duration of each class recording varied from 45 to 70 minutes. Each group was observed 3 times in each stage, and we have 3 stages in total. We divided them in the first one being April, which marks the beginning of online classes, and it is basically the onset of teaching virtually. The second stage is in August, which marks the beginning of the second term of the year, and it is usually around this time when difficulties or challenges are spotted and worked on, so they're addressed. Then there's the third stage, which is in November, and it marks the end of the academic year. It's basically an overview of the practices and online resources that were shown throughout the year.
This is what Nati mentioned, version presented in a figure. So we have the teachers on one side, and as you can see, teacher A was there throughout the observations in April and August and November. We have a total of 45 hours of her classes, and we observed 9 of those. Teachers B and C, as you can see, replaced teacher D and E after the second observation, so in August and November. And finally, D and E that were present only for the first period. It will be in April.
So for our data analysis, we use 2 different methods, the first and main one being the observational tool, complemented by the teacher's interview. Now, the data that has been collected will be divided into meaningful units. This term, we defined it as data collected that shared similar features to the point of being able to assign them the same category. This was done in order to provide a better and more accurate results. Now, these meaningful units are lesson features, students' engagement, student-teacher report, and online resources. Now, these meaningful units we can observe in any traditional F2F classroom setting. So as a result, what we wanted to observe and describe is if these were able to adapt in a virtual modality.
So for this part of the slide, we have the analysis, and we did 2 cycles of analysis. The first one was the memoing during class recording. So basically, both of us were watching each recording and writing down important things that we thought were going to be significant for completing the observational tool later. And also, after each recording, we discussed what we saw, what we felt during the class recording, everything. And then the second cycle would be completing the observational tool with quantitative information. And with all of this, we were able to do a triangulation process with 3 things: the things that we observed during the class recordings, the elements that we used to complete the observational tool, and finally the interviews with the teachers. So we have the whole thing to do the results properly. And also with this, we ensure objectivity and avoid bias by cross-examining different data.
Now, for the findings, and as part of the triangulation mentioned before, we use the qualitative information that was introduced into the observational tool to make graphs or figures that we're going to be describing in the following slides. We did this in order to make our findings more perceptible and more evident, so you can see the process of the evolution that these practices showed throughout our research. The first meaningful unit was lesson features. And basically, it consisted of how the lesson was presented with the necessary elements or subunits, such as an overview of the lesson, what is expected of the lesson, if the lesson followed a proper pace, if it followed a logical sequence, and if they have a proper closure or wrap up by the end of it. Again, all of these characteristics we can observe in a traditional F2F classroom setting. So we wanted to observe if they were able to adapt to the virtual modality. Now, for the figure, the corresponding values are: 1 is adaptation was not observed, number 2 is adapted with difficulty, and number 3 is it was adapted seamlessly. So in the figure example shown in the slide, we can see that first graders of the first grade presented difficulties in this particular subunit, which is pace lesson properly using technology. Now, we believe that we were able to identify why they struggle so much is because they were presented with a teacher switch. The teacher changed from the first to the second observation, so students were adapting to the virtual modality and getting to know their new teacher as well. However, by the third observation, they were able to adapt, but with difficulties still. And we can also appreciate that the second and third grade did not have major problems in this subunit. Teachers and students were able to follow a smooth pace that basically was just transfer from probably previous school experience.
For the second meaningful unit, we have students' engagement. This is how students participate in class, taking into consideration the active participation of the students, if they were able to follow instructions properly, and if they contributed to an overall active, collaborative, and cooperative environment. Basically, this is the students' response to what the teacher was doing during the lesson. So how the students participated in overall, in all the different activities that you have in each class, in each observational stage. So the figure 8 that we have here is about active, collaborative, and cooperative learning is favored. And again, as the other figure, second grade and third grade did not have a lot of issues. Then again, in first grade, we have the issue again in the second observation of the teacher switch. So of course, they have a harder time participating in classes again. And you will be able to see this in a lot of figures. But basically, this is talking about how the students were able to relate to the lesson and how they participate in class.
Now, for the third meaningful unit, we have the student-teacher report, and we observe how both parts interacted throughout the duration of the lesson. The subunits of these being if teachers asked questions to monitor the students' progress, if teachers gave sufficient time to students to answer to their questions, if they listened to them and responded in a proper manner to them. So in the figure presented, we can see that the second and third grade did not encounter major difficulties in this subunit. Teachers were able to monitor their students successfully and verify that they were still on task. From the very first observation, students relied a lot on their teacher throughout the entirety of the class and across the different stages of our observation. We were able to observe as well that there was already a pre-established dynamic between teachers and students, and that they had just carried on that already known interaction to the virtual modality. However, the first grade, again, was a little bit more delicate since we're talking about young learners. We're talking about students that are 6 or 7 years old. And as educators, we know that being in first grade already represents a challenge on its own. So adding to that fact, they had to connect and build a relationship with their teachers through a computer, which did represent a significant challenge that perhaps hindered this rapport building process.
The final meaningful unit that we examined was online resources, which consisted on the online materials and elements brought to enhance the lesson, if the online resource was of an appropriate level for students and if it aided the lesson properly. And also if the teacher integrated the different types of online resources and if they knew how to properly use it. So basically we have two elements in this category. The first one, if the online resource is useful by itself and in the lesson, and then if the teacher knew how to use it properly and also give instructions to use it properly to the students, that I think is a very difficult challenge, especially for very young learners, and in this case the first graders again. So we have the year 17 that talks about presented user-friendly online resources according to the student's level. In this case, you can see that the third grade did not have any difficulties, but they are also the oldest ones in first cycle, so they already have some skills that they can just transfer in order to do the things that the teacher asked them to do with the online resources. Second grade presented a positive evolution, but it was very difficult to find, we observed that it was very difficult to find proper online resources for first grade to use them across the stages. Plus, the teacher had to use a lot of the time just explaining what they have to do with the online tool, and they are little kids basically. So there were still we still saw some evolution, but it still they presented some difficulties.
Okay, so having elaborated on the meaningful units and what they represent, we can condense it all down to these key findings. The first one being lesson features, they did presented a positive outcome by the end of the third observation. We're talking about November in most units. What was appreciated is that the first grade ended the year adapting with difficulties, unlike the second and third grade, that by the second observation, so by August, they were able to adapt seamlessly across the subunits that were observed. This means that the grades that constitute the first cycle were able to adapt these lesson features from a traditional F2F classroom setting to a virtual one. Here is a quote of teacher A. She's the one in charge of the first graders. And she contributed by saying that it was difficult to keep students engaged throughout the lesson. So by the end of some of these lessons, students just wanted to disconnect. So this aligns with what we observed through the different stages of our data analysis, that it was difficult to keep students engaged, for them to follow a sequence of a lesson through the virtual mode and actually benefit from proper pacing and all the other lesson features that we mentioned earlier. For the second key finding, we have the students' engagement. It did presented varied results, especially for the first grade, as they experienced, as we mentioned, changes throughout the observed recordings. Second grade improved between observations, meaning the first and the second one. And the third grade adapted seamlessly from the very first observation, which was in April. So there was an observable evolution of these teaching practices that allowed this to happen. As time went on, connections were made between teachers and students, even if they were not present in the same physical space. Overall, teaching and learning requires fast and reliable internet connection. So this meaningful unit leans a lot on external factors that were probably out of the teacher's control. And teacher C, who was in charge of the third grade, she said that young learners need constant guidance and reassurance, which is more difficult to create in this format. It is definitely more challenging to create significant bonds with first graders, being their first year of formal schooling, and without being in the same physical space. So being able to awaken that curiosity in young learners for them to be able to engage with the lesson through a computer was one of the most difficult tasks she shared with us.
For the third meaningful unit, we have the student teacher report. which showed great results from the first observation stage. Teachers were able to adapt consistently in order to nurture a good rapport with their respective students. This was very interesting because this means that it wasn't necessary for the students to be at school to form a good relationship with their teacher. It was still possible to have a good rapport even if it was in an online setting, even if you were behind the screen. The students still relate to the teacher and the teacher was still able to talk to the students, make use of different online resources for different activities. Teacher B mentioned that because having classes in a different setting and changing it even more from what they are already familiar with, I think was going to be way too much for them. So teachers were aware of the difficulties and the challenges that they were going to face, but at the end, we could still see a clear evolution of this, even though from the very first observation, the results were already good. And finally, we have the online resources. This displayed a significant evolution as well as teachers acquired more knowledge in the area and started to implement these new tools in their respective classes. This is interesting because we're going to mention some of the tools that the teachers usually used. But in the first observation, for example, they used a Kahoot and the teacher was in charge of the whole Kahoot. The teacher was projecting, the students were just marking the options or even doing it in the chat, not really using the tool properly. But by the end of the third observation, maybe the student was the one projecting the Kahoot and everyone else was participating. So the teacher took a more supportive role by the end of the observations, especially in the third grade. So it was amazing to see how the skills evolved throughout the stages as well. But again, it was a bit challenging for teachers to find appropriate resources that would fit the first graders' skills because of the factors that we mentioned before. And also, teacher C shared with us that it was a process with its challenges, but it amazed me how first and second graders managed to, with a proper and systematic training, achieve what we needed from them.
So, answering our first main question of this research is how traditional EFL practices and resources evolved in a virtual classroom at the elementary level during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, there was an evident evolution of these observable practices and the way resources were incorporated systematically throughout the lessons. As teachers felt more comfortable, they were able to mirror that in their classes. As they seem more fluid, they would be paced more smoothly, and the lessons by the end of the observations had a higher level of technical complexity, which is what Vero was mentioning. First, the teacher is in charge of making all the adjustments and facilitating the students to interact with their tool provided. However, then the students manage to be part of that as well. Creating a blend of different lesson features, activities, and the integration of different online resources.
For the first secondary question, that was what challenges did teachers encounter when transferring traditional practices and resources to a virtual classroom? We were able to answer this properly with the teachers' interviews because they mentioned all the factors. And also we were able to separate them in two categories. We have internal factors and external factors. The first one being things such as improving the students' attention span with different games during the lesson, delivering explanations shortly and effectively, and creating a safe place where students could lower their affective filter. So all of these are things that teachers can improve on as time goes on. They can control these to a certain extent. But then you have the external factors that were mostly out of the teacher's control. The most common ones were the space where the students connected from. For example, it was very common to see a student in their living room and the whole family behind the student. And of course, you can see that it was very noisy because the student had trouble listening to the class, or if the teacher asked a question, they couldn't reply properly, things like that. Also, the internet speed and quality and the student's devices characteristics. This was very interesting as well because, for example, if the student connected from a cell phone, they couldn't really click on the link because they will exit the meeting. So they have to pick and choose different activities, and the experience will not be the same for every student. That was one of the things that we observed the most during this external factors phase.
Now, for our secondary question, what online teaching practices and resources were the most successful in a virtual classroom? So again, we relied a lot on the teacher's interview and their perspective being the ones carrying on this lesson features. So, as a general overview, the most successful ones were the teaching practices and resources that made learning meaningful. So, teachers had to look for particular factors or elements that students can relate to make their lesson more meaningful and engaging. And as teachers mentioned, that it was more difficult to get the students to focus because of these external factors that Vero mentioned earlier, being with their family, surrounded by noise. So they had to be innovative and creative to implement attention grabbers or TPR in order to bring them back to the lesson and move forward. So the success was always something that they had to work for constantly. And these are four tools that the teachers that were interviewed agree on made their lesson flow more smoothly, and it was user friendly for the students. So we have Google for Education with its many features, the Google Classroom, the Google Meet itself, where we're gathering, um, Google Documents, Slides, and the Jamboard, which is basically like a whiteboard, a virtual whiteboard. And then we have the Kahoot and Wordwall that are online tools that give educational games for students to from students with different levels, right? And then they used and implemented online libraries throughout their lessons.
For us, it was very important to include the implications of this study because there are a lot of them, actually. It can be used as a framework for specific policies regarding online education. When we were doing the literature review, we found different studies, but for older students, for universities, or even secondary education, but we didn't really find a lot of things for young kids or young learners, especially when we were seeing, for example, the online resources that were used with first graders. They didn't have a lot of variety for the needs that they presented, as an example, especially for elementary level students in a similar context. The challenges should also be taken into consideration when discussing the advantages and disadvantages of having an online education, especially in this level, and how they can address it in new policies that can affect part of the population. The evolution of practices were evident across observations, as we saw, especially by the end of the third one, that you can see the evolution as they were able to do more things that they were able to do at the beginning, which also relies on the constant feedback that the teachers were getting from the way students responded to the lessons. Overall, this study can add another perspective to the bigger context, which are the teaching practices in an online education setting, which happened due to the pandemic. So this was not suggested, this needed to happen.
So to wrap up, we have our conclusion. The unique circumstances, this COVID-19 pandemic, led to one of the biggest changes in how education is delivered by teachers. The shift had a huge impact on how people teach and learn, and teachers had to be at the center of the storm, learning new ways, adapting, and developing ways to help their students learn. Now, the challenges came from different sides. As we mentioned earlier, there were external and internal factors during that period, yet the main goal was to overcome these difficulties and create a space where teachers could accomplish the goals that they set at the beginning of the year. They achieved this by using different methods, techniques, resources, and alternative ways of conducting classes, and they were able to achieve something that was not done before, teaching first cycle through a virtual mode entirely. So thank you so much for your attention, and that was it.
Let them, let's give them a round of applause, even though you did great. Yes. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you so much. I really get excited with oral defenses. So you should be proud. You did a very clear study, very well framed, and over under 30 minutes. So the presentation. So good. I'm very happy to hear that.
Thank you.
I want to open the floor for Professor Weaver, or if she wants to start, or I don't want to put you on the spot, but it could be Professor Bento as well, if she wants to start to kick off the questions.
Hello, I'll be glad to start. I would like to ask the ladies, I say the ladies, our students, if you could explain a little bit more to me, active, collaborative, and cooperative in terms of teaching, because I think those are important terms, and I just wanted to see how you interpret that. How would you explain to me what would be the difference between active learning, collaborative, and cooperative learning?
Okay. So we're English teachers. We're teaching a language, so there needs to be interaction. We label it active, collaborative learning since it is a classroom setting, and teachers and students are conscious of that they have to talk and interact together. So by doing this through a virtual mode, it was more challenging, right? You need to take turns. We're talking about young learners, first and second and third graders. They are still learning and acquiring these skills of waiting for their turns. So that's what we observed in the subunits, in this meaningful unit that you mentioned. So that's what we observed. If they were participating properly, and if they would interact or answer to the teacher's questions.
Okay, thank you. Another thing, I'm always thinking of possible publishing when we see works that are presented. So in your presentation, which I thought was very clear, as Dr. Ramos said, what I did notice that in some of your slides, you have the months. I think it was April, August, and November, but it did not say the year 2020 on those particular slides. So that would be something that you would want to include that if you were going to present your findings or adapt your PowerPoint for a future moment. One of the expressions that I heard, which was very interesting to me, was this: to lower the affective factor. To lower the affective factor. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. I mean, I can intuitively kind of have a feeling, but I'm assuming that it has to do with this that it's related, let's say, to all that happens in terms of rapport and the special challenges of teaching first grade. Because your data seems to show quite clearly that the most affected population are the youngest children, who perhaps were least, how can I say, that it was less successful having a formal educational experience for first graders. Perhaps, I don't know. According to the law, the children had to be in school, they had to be enrolled, but how much they were learning, we don't really know. It may show up later, perhaps. But I'm just wanting to ask you, this lower the affective factor, if you could explain that a little bit more. Perhaps Veronica, since
Yes.
you explained the other question.
Of course, lower the affecting filter. We actually learned this with Miss Bento, I think, during class. It's basically make the students feel comfortable during the class, because if they are nervous, they cannot really learn properly. So when we say that, is the techniques that the teachers are using to make the students feel more at ease in the classroom. For example, in most cases, the teachers started the class asking questions. How was your day? How was your family? And the students share, because they are, especially little kids, they love to talk. And they were sharing things, and that way also the teacher know more about the students, and the students get more comfortable during the class. So when we mention lowering the affective filter, we are trying to say that was the goal of the teachers, to try to make the students feel not really at home at school, probably, to feel more comfortable during the class, to make the learning experience a more positive way or manner in some ways.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. those are the only the questions I wanted to put you on the spot. Thanks.
Ladies, I have this question that it's more related to your experience than to the work per se. Did you get the chance to experience what these teachers did during the pandemic? Were you teaching during that year on virtual mode or not?
Yes, yes,
And
yes,
how was your experience compared
yes,
to what these teachers said? Did you find something similar, something different? How
yes.
was it?
Yes, in my case, I taught second grade, and it was my first year at the school I was working. So it was the extra challenge. I love my kids so much because I saw that they needed a lot of support. So for me, it was at one point, it was more important for me to make them feel comfortable and to make them feel safe than to teach, because if you don't do those steps, it's impossible for them to learn properly. And overall, I think 2020 was a very strange year for all of us. So it was, for me, my priority was to make the kids feel comfortable and at ease in the class. And the secondary part was to make them learn, because children are very smart, so they can learn very quickly. So yes, that was my experience as a second grade teacher. And it was pretty similar to what we saw in the recordings, especially by the end of the year, that the students were like, "Teacher, we missed you a lot." I was like, "Yes, we missed you too."
So on my part, I also taught virtually. I had several groups though, and I had first grade and fourth graders, and it was my first year also teaching high schoolers. So I was able to kind of compare and contrast the different age groups. It was definitely more challenging teaching young learners. The first graders were all over the place. They just wanted to show you their pets, their stuff, present, everything. So I implemented in my classroom like a 5-minute sharing time. So they had that space to actually share what they wanted to show to their classmates that they haven't seen, for months. And unlike the high schoolers that they just had their cameras off and you don't know if they were there or not. So that was interesting to observe and compare as well.
Well, thank you, girls. And Ms. Weaver, what they mentioned about the affective filter, it's one of the very well-known theories of acquiring languages by Mr. Krashen. So if you want to do some research on that, then go ahead. I think his works are available for free on the internet. And he has some very interesting points of view regarding language acquisition. So yes, it comes from Krashen and his idea of the affective filter and how that prevents students from acquiring language when they don't feel safe and secure in the classroom. So thank you, ladies. Dr. Ramos, the microphone is back to you.
Thank you so much those are very thoughtful questions. I do have a doubt. Am I supposed to ask questions? Am I allowed to ask questions, right? Okay, so then it's my turn. I was wondering, you clarify very well the methodology piece and explain why you chose a case study. What do you, based on also what you were sharing of your experiences as teachers of elementary school, what do you think, what other types of study would you do on the same topic by using a different methodology? Is my question clear?
Yes, your question is clear. I would use a mixed methods, right, in order to perhaps compare the results in a more qualitative manner, and not mainly on young learners because they're adapting, but probably transfer that same idea of a before and after the pandemic, of these unprecedented circumstances that affected us throughout the world. So I would probably compare their development, how how they interact in class, the results that they have, their grades, their evaluation. In a more academic and quantitative manner, I would do like a contrast on this main, topic. I don't know about you, but if you have a different view.
Yes, in the part of the implications that we saw, I think it would be very interesting if we did it in a major scale, because our case study is a very small sample in comparison to the things that we can do, because the experience that we have in this school, where even because I work in a different one, it was very different from my school in some aspects. So I think it would be very interesting to do it in a major scale, not only in one school, but not really all schools, because all schools it's too much, too different. But for example, if this school has 10 hours of English per week, in a school that also have like 8 or 10 hours per week of English. So do a comparative study of different but yet similar schools to see what could be done, or the overall overview of the results, if they are very different, or maybe the teachers implemented different techniques that could be more useful to different classes within the same school characteristics. I think that would be very interesting.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts of how to expand knowledge. Yes. And I think your contributions and the implications of your study are very relevant. Now, if there's nobody else is somebody else here in the room have a question? One more question before we ask everybody to leave? If there's nobody, then thank you everybody for your time. We're going to ask the students to leave the room, and we're going to have a conversation and convene here with the committee.
Oh, you can continue.